My name is Brian Carpenter. I'm one of the co-directors for the Harvey A. Friedman Center for Aging, working closely with Natalie and Nancy Morrow-Howell. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to this Issues in Aging seminar. We'll have a couple of announcements at the end of today's presentation and discussion about some of the upcoming programs at the center, but we wanted to dive right in and give our guest speaker, Peggy Smith, an opportunity to share her wisdom and knowledge with all of us. I'll tell you a little bit about Peggy. Peggy is one of the leading scholars in the regulation of care work that occurs both inside and outside the home, and that includes child care, home care, and elder care. She's published widely on issues such as home-based care and work and family balance, parental status, employment discrimination, and elder care. In addition to her research and teaching here at WashU, she is also the faculty ombuds for the Danforth campus for the university. And among her many professional affiliations, she's a member of the American Law Institute and the Labor Law Group, a national organization of leading scholars in labor and employment law. Peggy got her BA at Yale and stayed on for a master's at Yale as well, and then completed her JD at Harvard Law School. And we're so pleased that she's joined us today to share her expertise and perspective on this important topic. Welcome, Peggy. Take it over.
Oh, thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. I should go ahead and note that I am recovering from the thing that isn't COVID. And so I say that because every now and then I find myself having bouts of uncontrollable coughing. So apologies in advance. So my presentation this afternoon centers on the legal regulation of domestic work and the people who do that work. This category includes in-home family child care providers, also house cleaners, as well as home care workers who care for individuals who are elderly and disabled. My comments will have implications for the broad group of workers, but I am going to focus primarily on home care workers. And just by way of making sure we're all on the same page, for purposes of home care work, I'm talking about services such as assistance with personal activities of daily living, things such as helping clients with grooming, dressing, bathing, and the like. It also includes household activities, shopping, cleaning, meal prep, and some workers also assist with low-level medical tasks, such as managing medication. So I presented on this topic at a aging seminar back in 2013. And it's useful to note at the outset that the home care industry has experienced some important developments during that time, and yet in really profound ways, not much has changed in the industry. So it's a bit of a mixed bag. I personally gained new insights when I had to step into the role of a long distance family caregiver of an aging parent a couple of years ago. And as an informal family caregiver, I underestimated how complicated and emotionally draining this work can be. And that experience definitely informs my understanding of paid care work. Obviously, I'm not a paid care provider. I am your typical informal family care provider, and I'm also doing it at a distance. So these groups, paid on the one hand, unpaid on the other hand, they don't need to be mutually exclusive, and they definitely involve some very comparable challenges and concerns. Before focusing on the specifics of home care, I want to share with you a blog post that I read recently. And the blog post conveyed a sentiment that offers some important framing for this discussion. And the blog post observed that care is as essential to life on our planet as is water. And that sentiment captures the fact that care is really integral and fundamental to who we are, to our children, to our families, as well as to our economy. And I suspect that sentiment probably resonates with many of you who are currently caregivers or who have been caregivers in some capacity, either formal or informal. Perhaps you find yourself caring for an elderly family member or a friend. Perhaps you're caring for a child. And I suspect many of you might be in that sandwich generation, caring both for elderly relatives as well as young children. As importantly, all of us have had the experience of being care recipients, obviously, as infants, even if we don't remember it. And I say that to really sort of, shed light on this sentiment that care is as essential to life on our planet as is water. So that observation taps into another kind of reality. Because, of course, even as care is so essential, for many Americans, care is neither affordable or is it readily accessible. And when I think about that, I think about it from the perspective of care workers, that there is yet another illusion when we think about care being essential. And that is, for workers, care work is rarely a decent job. It's rarely a job that is valued and treated with respect. It's often not a job that pays a living wage. It tends to be a job that is all-consuming, that often does not allow adequate time for workers to focus on their family and friends. In an ideal world, it would be a job that wasn't backbreaking, and it would be a job that would provide workers with workplace benefits and opportunities for professional training. And so that's part of the challenge that I want to talk about. Why is it that from the perspective of workers, this has not been a decent job? When you think about those two sides, different sides of the same coin, it highlights that we're confronting in this country a care crisis. And if you think about that crisis from the standpoint of home care in particular, it's an unstable industry. There are too few workers. They deliver compromised care. And there's also a growing demand for such care, especially among the elderly. The crisis looks a lot like prior care crisis, right? We're currently confronting a crisis, but the reality is that we have been confronting a care crisis for some time. It's really a continuum of the same set of dynamics, although I would say that this care crisis has clearly been amplified by the pandemic and the lingering implications of the pandemic. It has been hard to miss discussion of the crisis. It has been a dominating headline in news stories, on television, on radio, and in print. These are some of the headlines that one can readily see in terms of the focus on what are we going to do about this care crisis. And so I want to think a minute about what the crisis means, right? At its core, the crisis represents a demand for care that is at an all-time high. And that demand stems in part from an aging population that over the last several years has grown at its fastest rate since 1880. For some of you, if you read the Wall Street journals, you may have come across this story, which was in the Wall Street Journal last week. And the title was, America has never had so many 65-year-olds. And the story reports that more Americans are turning 65 this year than at any prior time in history. Indeed, 1.1 million Americans are going to turn 65 this year. The demand also reflects increased longevity. It reflects a preference for elderly individuals to age in place, which is within the confines of their own homes. And it also reflects the reality that increasingly there are too few informal care providers. And the bulk of informal care providers are mainly women. We're talking about wives and adult daughters. Too few informal care providers to satisfy that exploding demand. If you think about what this situation has meant for workers, we can think about it in terms of prior to the pandemic and what happened during the pandemic. Certainly, prior to the pandemic, as a society, we have relied on a pool of low-wage care workers who have served as a bit of a safety valve for that growing demand. That said, it's certainly an imperfect solution. Given the lack of informal caregivers, there have been efforts to intensify efforts to try and offload the cost of caregiving onto the weary shoulders of low-wage care workers. It's always been a frayed strategy, but for a long time, it has allowed us to postpone what I regard as a real reckoning, a come to Jesus moment, if you will, where we're forced to really figure out how are we going to care for an increasingly elderly population, and to do so in a manner that also has a fundamental appreciation of the work that is being done. The pandemic did not obliterate that strategy of trying to offload care work onto the shoulders of low-wage caregivers, but it certainly saw a significant decline in the availability of the pool of formal caregivers, and it exacerbated a situation that was already strained. In an ideal world, what the pandemic would have done was it not only would have resulted in our taking increased notice of the problem, but it would have also led us to some fundamental changes. We can talk about that more, but I don't think that has happened as a result of the pandemic. So on the one hand, we have this growing demand. And of course, on the other hand, what we have are significant shortages in the availability of formal paid home care providers. And if you think about the shortage of workers, it's really not surprising that we have encountered growing difficulties in trying to attract new workers as well as trying to retain existing workers. And to understand those shortages, you really have to think about the poor working conditions in the home care industry. The slide that I quickly skipped over is a slide that notes sort of this incongruity. That is, even as the demand for home care is at an all-time high, or it has been over the last decade, it is ranked among the top 5 occupations in the country. And normally, when you think about supply and demand, one would think, okay, given the demand, that is going to lead to an improvement in the job conditions. But we've not seen that. The 2 primary groups of workers at issue are home health aides as well as personal aides. And so what we've seen is that poor working conditions have persisted in the home care industry. So I want to just talk very briefly about some of those conditions. The first thing to note is that this job can really be incredibly grueling. You have some workers who work and they're living caregivers, such that some of them are on call 24 hours a day. If we think of the conditions in terms of wages, consider that even as the job has this incredible demand, the workers remain incredibly underpaid. There are considerable variations when you're talking about wages. There are variations across states. There are also variations across sectors. But if we're looking at the median salary and we're doing it for all home care jobs, what you see is that workers are definitely at the bottom of that economic ladder. So this quickly shows median earnings for these 2 groups of workers at 2 points in time relative to the median earnings for all jobs. And the situation with regards to home care workers is so incredibly adverse that you currently have a situation that many workers who are providing care must themselves rely on the same kind of publicly provided care as the clients for whom they're caring. You also see a situation where home care work has an incredibly high incidence of injury and illness. And this is not surprising when one appreciates that home care workers are overwhelmingly, they're working by themselves. They're working in private homes. They don't have coworkers who can help them lift and transfer a client. And so because they're doing it without any assistance, that has exacerbated the extent to which the job can really be understood as one that is a dangerous job. We don't think of this job as a dangerous job, but in fact, these workers have a much higher incidence of illnesses and injuries relative to other workers. So a couple of other useful points that won't come as a surprise. Benefits. Most home care workers are not receiving work-related benefits such as health insurance, sick leave, or any kind of entitlement to a pension or to some kind of retirement fund. And so these conditions have often led commentators to pose the question, right? You have home care workers caring for the elderly, but who's actually going to care for the workers themselves? And of course, as I noted, the issue is not only the workers, but of course, the conditions in the job are inextricably connected to the quality of care that workers can provide. Poor job conditions have incredibly intensified the shortage of home care workers, and in turn has also jeopardized the quality of care that these workers are able to provide. So I want to, moving forward, here's what I really want to hopefully do in the time that I have left. I want to talk about the backdrop to the current situation. And I also want to talk about two premises and pitfalls if time allows. I want to talk about unionization efforts, and I also want to talk about the Domestic Workers Bill of Rights. So the first thing I want to do is start with a little bit of background, a history of marginalization and exclusion. Because domestic work includes the performance of domestic activities within the space of private homes, the law regards it as a form of domestic service. So that phrase is a phrase that is no longer used, but it is a concept that was very much alive when our country really began to lean into the provision of labor regulations and protections for workers. Historically, labor and employment laws excluded domestic service from coverage. That was true during the Progressive Era, when states were enacting labor law protections predominantly for women workers. Those types of protection in the form of the regulation that required that women workers be provided with minimum rates of pay, as well as regulation that limited the number of hours that women workers could work. Those state-based laws consistently excluded domestic workers. Again, people tend to think, well, workers weren't covered by progressive legislation because no one was thinking about these issues. And in fact, the history makes it clear. People were thinking about these workers. Indeed, during the time that state progressive laws were passed at the turn of the century, more women worked in domestic work than in any other occupation, and yet they were repeatedly excluded from state laws regulating work on behalf of women workers. And you also saw that same level of exclusion extending into the New Deal era at the point that we saw a burgeoning development of workplace protections at the federal level. And so here are some of the key pieces of legislation that formed a part of the New Deal. The National Labor Relations Act, the Fair Labor Standards Act. So the first act is the act that allows workers to organize and form a union. The FSLA, I should say, is the law that provides for minimum wages and also overtime compensation. The Social Security Act, and there is also a short-lived piece of legislation known as the National Industrial Recovery Act. All four of these pieces of legislation specifically excluded domestic service from coverage. Now, the point that I want to make is that those exclusions were not inevitable. Each of those exclusions represented a value-laden choice on the perceived value or lack thereof of domestic work, as well as on the perceived value or lack thereof of the many women who were performing that work. At times, most notably during the Progressive Era, the exclusion really spoke to gendered assumptions about the kind of work that required government intervention. At other times, most notably during the New Deal, you saw those gendered notions about domestic work becoming entangled with racist beliefs. And so this old cartoon captures a sentiment that was alive and well during the New Deal, which is that beginning around, I believe the time period was, if you look at who were the workers who were primarily involved in this kind of work, particularly with respect to the turn of the century, increasingly domestic service became synonymous with Black women's work. And the exclusions that were obvious during the New Deal era that saw these workers being cast aside is really the result of a compromise, given that Southern legislatures wanted to ensure that they would have a continued availability of Black workers as a cheap source, not only for domestic work, but also foreign work. And so those two groups of workers were the only groups that were consistently excluded from New Deal legislation. Some of those exclusions have gone by the wayside, but some of those exclusions have also persisted over time. So with that background, I want to talk about two areas that I put under the heading of premise and pitfalls. So the first is unionization. So I want to say a word about the unionization of home care workers. Beginning in the 1990s, labor succeeded in coming up with a strategy to successfully organize these workers. And the workers who have been organized are a particular subset of home care workers. They are the workers who are providing publicly funded home care. Primarily, they're doing this by way of Medicaid funding. They're also workers who are providing what's known as consumer-directed care. And so here's what I mean by consumer-directed care. Most recipients who qualify for publicly funded home care are getting the care by way of an agency. So if you have a relative who qualifies for this care, you go to a home care agency, that agency sets you up with a worker. The agency is being paid with state funds and is using those funds to pay the workers, but the employment relationship is between the agency and the worker. Increasingly, however, we see that publicly funded care is being delivered through what's known as this consumer-directed care model. And in the context of consumer-directed care, the employment relationship is between the worker and the care recipient, or the worker and a family member of the care recipient, even as it is the state who is actually providing the funding. What's really important about this is that labor was able to succeed despite the fact that when it came to trying to organize home care workers, the common perception was that these are workers who are completely unorganizable. And so I want to talk about how labor succeeded in being able to organize these workers. And they did so by following the money. They recognized that obviously you can't try and go after the actual employers, right? The actual employers are the care recipients and their family members. These are people who are already receiving publicly funded care. These are not people who have the financial wherewithal to make improvements in the conditions of the kind of work being done by the workers themselves. And so what labor did was it engaged in a campaign to persuade state legislatures to adopt laws that would recognize the workers as employees of the state, as public employees. And they were successful in a number of states. So these are the states where you have laws on the books that allow this group of workers to form a union and to engage in collective action. And those workers who have been fortunate enough to have the ability to form a union, there has been positive developments as a result. So very quickly, union workers overall receive a 20% increase in their overall compensation. In addition, union workers are far more likely to receive workplace benefits such as paid time off, as well as medical and dental benefits. And so there has definitely been a strong correlation between improved working conditions and unionization. That said, remember, this is under the heading of premise and pitfalls. That's been the premise, but it has also come with some pitfalls. In particular, there has been a conservative assault on this group of workers. Here's a heading that captured the issue. Facing national home care crisis, attacking caregivers is a move backwards, but the attack has come from conservative organizations. And here's why they have engaged in an assault on these workers. These workers are the new face of labor. They are responsible for the biggest public sector union gains over the last 20 years. Here's an article that was in the New York Times when the very first consumer-directed home care workers were organized back in 1999 in LA. So right now, approximately 600,000 of these workers are unionized, but given the projections that this occupation will continue to grow, it is expected that union density will also increase. The conservative movement has been very vocal in its attack. And specifically, it has made it clear that the goal is to try to weaken labor generally. And to do so, the conservative movement has come after the unionization of these workers. They've done so in a couple of ways, but I appreciate that timing is an issue. So I'll just highlight the two ways that you have seen this assault on home care workers. One was that the conservative movement led a case that was decided by the Supreme Court. The conservative movement funded the litigation, was instrumental in getting the case filed. It was a case where the Supreme Court greatly limited the ability of states to treat consumer-directed care workers as public employees by passing legislation to do so. The second attack has to do with a change in rules by the Center for Medicare and Medicaid, and that change has made it increasingly more difficult for workers who belong to a union to be able to pay their union dues. Let me talk about one other development that has been positive, but also has had some pitfalls, and that is the Domestic Workers Alliance. So the goal of this organization is to try to establish a floor of basic legal protections for workers. And the impetus for doing that is that even as unionization has met with considerable success, the reality is that in the vast majority of all states, unions have not been able to organize domestic workers. The vast majority of all states are known as right-to-work states, which are utterly resistant to the organization of workers across the board. And so given that you only have effective unionization in about 10 states, the goal is to try to come up with a strategy for workers regardless of where they live. And so this group, the National Domestic Workers Alliance, they've done that by passing these Domestic Workers Bill of Rights. The first one was passed in 2010. As of this year, you have a total of 10 states that have passed these bills. You also have a number of cities that have passed Domestic Workers Bill of Rights. And so here's what the bills do. The goal is to try and ensure that domestic workers are entitled to the same set of rights that are extended to other workers in the particular region or state. And so the very first bill, New York, made sure that domestic workers were entitled to protection under the state wage and hour law, as well as to ensure that workers were entitled to vacation days. There's variation from state to state, but the goal across the board is to ensure that there is a threshold so as to be able to provide workers with decent working conditions. This strategy is also limited, right? There are only 10 states that have actually enacted Domestic Workers Bill of Rights. The strategy is also limited because most of these states' statutes specifically exclude consumer-directed home care workers. And so what has happened more recently is that there has been a proposed national Domestic Workers Bill of Rights. This was first proposed back in 2018. It has been reintroduced every year since 2018. And the goal is to bring all domestic workers within the purview of federal workplace laws, and to also figure out a way to ensure that even for workers who are not regarded as employees of a particular care recipient, that they will also be provided for. And so that is out there. I'm not sure how hopeful we should be. The Biden administration has increasingly tried to focus on improvements for domestic workers that only require the power of the executive branch. So, for example, the Biden administration has issued several executive orders. Those orders only apply to workers who are being paid with public funds. It does not reach the many workers who are working for private employers. The last thing I want to aim with is this observation. Domestic workers are workers like any others and workers like no other. So this motto or expression was coined by the International Labor Organization, the ILO. The ILO leads efforts to try and articulate and implement universal labor standards. And it has been at the forefront to try and do that on behalf of domestic workers. In 2011, the International Labor Organization agreed to a groundbreaking convention on Domestic Work. And that convention establishes international standards to improve the quality and the conditions of domestic work. Now, in order for that convention to apply, every country has to ratify the convention. Not surprisingly, the US has not ratified that convention. That said, what this expression really makes clear is that for most of the history of workplace legislation and domestic work, legislatures have embraced a default position. And that default position looks at domestic work and says, but this work is so unique compared to other types of work. This is work that occurs in the private space of individual homes. This is work where people are working for the most part by themselves. And they have used those differences to justify excluding domestic work from the protection of labor and employment legislation. And the sentiment really indicates that that default position has to be changed. Instead of using those differences as a justification to exclude workers, there has to be an understanding that even as domestic work is structured differently from other types of work, that should not be a reason to deny workers vital protection. That going forward, we have to come up with ways that when we look at legislation, we have to figure out to what extent can domestic work be included within existing legislation, and to the extent that there are real differences between domestic work and other types of work, how do we allow for the specificity of that work? How do we change the laws so as to ensure that these workers are still going to be covered? So I am going to stop on that note and happy to answer any questions that folks might have.
Thank you so much, Peggy. Great presentation. You covered a lot of ground. And I'd invite anybody to either put a question in the chat, raise your hand, turn on your camera and wave wildly if you've got a question or comment for Peggy. And Peggy, if you don't mind, I might start things off by asking a question myself.
Sure.
You know, when you were talking about this at the very end here about this complication of or the unique position that domestic care workers are in, I wondered whether there are other professions that domestic care workers have tried to model themselves after, from at least from a legislative and rights perspective. I mean, I don't know much about this area, but it occurs to me that I can think of several different tradespeople who are also in people's private homes quite often, not doing the kind of intimate care that direct care workers are often doing. But is there a model there in other trades or professions?
So when the movement started to organize domestic workers, the group of workers that provided the model actually were janitors. And they weren't working in people's individual homes, but they were being organized by sectors. And so that particular template provided some useful lessons. But the kind of model that labor came up with to organize consumer-directed care workers was really incredibly novel. It now is the model that other workers are pulling from. What we've seen happen is that, you know, once upon a time, this work really was truly unique, but over the course of time, increasingly, other working relationships are now reflecting some of the kinds of qualities that highlight domestic service work, which is to say, no longer is it the kind of workplace where, when I think about my parents, for example, my parents worked traditional labor relationships, this notion of 9 to 5, right? And they had a job with, for the most part, over the course of their lives, they had that one main employer. If you look at how people are working today, it has totally changed. Increasingly, more workers are beginning to look like the kinds of labor patterns that exemplify domestic service worker. And so that model is now serving as a sort of a launching pad for other workers.
Great, thank you. I had a couple questions come in. Nancy, do you want to unmute yourself and ask Peggy your question?
Okay. Good afternoon, and I'm so glad that I'm taking this webinar. I care for my mom who's 84, and I had to solicit for care so I can get care so I can continue to go to work. So this was a difficult thing to navigate. So and so my question was, is there like a difference, just because I decided not to put my mom in a nursing home because I wanted to care for her myself, but I realized I couldn't do it. So I need to go through that through an agency. Is there a difference, like with that particular model, with as a domestic worker being in my home versus just at a nursing home? Like, is there a difference? Because I feel like care would be outside of just being in my private home. Right?
Yeah. So, there are many different types of care work. Domestic work is the emblematic trait is that it happens within the private confines of an individual home. But if you really think about the activities that workers do, right? People who are performing the same kind of work, but they're doing it in an institutional setting, right? So, for example, we're talking about the kind of workers who are providing care in nursing homes. We're talking about low-wage workers who are also providing care in hospitals, or it's less care and more cleaning, right? We're also talking about, if we think about the big picture of domestic work, which really started with people doing cleaning related activities, we've always had for a long time institutional forms of that kind of work. And so, my statements have implications for those other types of work, but obviously what makes this so challenging, domestic work, is the history, the failure to recognize it as work because it was in the private sphere of the home. But across the board, when you're talking about low wage care work, it's low wage, right? Now, if we were to take a broader view and to say, well, who actually should qualify as a care worker, right? There's an argument that we should also loop in nurses, and they do provide care work, but there are critical differences in terms of how those workers are situated versus how domestic workers are situated. That said, there are lots of really fascinating alliances that have been made between some of these more professional groups of care workers and domestic workers who are still trying very hard to have people regard their work as professional work.
Thank you. A couple other questions coming in. James, I can read your question, but feel free to chime in if you'd like to ask it yourself.
Oh, I'm indifferent. If you wanted to ask it, that'd be fine. But I'm just curious, ever the optimistic, is there, I appreciate the discussion of how this is a crisis, and, I see it occurring, and appreciate that the challenges have been being created over the generations. So a big uphill battle. But are there any examples of success in confronting this care crisis, as you put it, particularly you think of the American society as very entrepreneurial in the private sector. Has anyone done a good job of addressing this, even on a small scale that you're aware of?
Sure. So there are big successes that have been limited, and then there are lots of innovative successes. The big successes for me, definitely I put unionization as a big success. It's limited, but it's certainly a major step in the right direction. Without a doubt, I put within that bucket those states that have passed Domestic Workers' Bill of Rights. It too is limited. And so when you look at an individual level, not an individual worker level, more region by region, there are lots of novel and innovative approaches that you see coming out of particular locales. For example, you go to places like New York, there's so many different organizations, advocacy organizations that are representing the interests of these workers, and many of them are being run by the workers themselves. They're focusing on trying to provide each other with support, and that really speaks to the notion that even as these workers are working individually by themselves, they figured out different ways to bring themselves together as a collective. Some of the things that these types of organizations are doing is they're really leaning into training. They're trying to attack the notion that this is unskilled work that really doesn't require any training. So they're putting on training programs, for example. Let me give one other illustration of what I regard as a really innovative approach. And that is a group of workers who were really trying to figure out how did they manage to convey to the employing class that this was work that was really valuable. And at the time, the employing class, we weren't talking about care recipients who were looking to get publicly subsidized care. We're talking about the traditional employing class, people who were looking to bring traditional domestic workers into their homes. Many of them were immigrant workers who were subjected to all sorts of vulnerabilities. So what they did was they took out an ad, and their ad made this group of individuals who came together look like an agency. So if you were flipping through looking for someone to provide you with domestic work, this group looked as if it was one of these merry maids, right? And they were staffed in the basement of a church, and the workers took turns staffing that basement location. You would call the number and you got on the phone a worker who sounded incredibly professional, right? You had no idea that it was just this ad hoc group of workers who were coming together. And what they did was that created a level of protection between workers and employers, right? It gave it the authority of an actual organization. The group would reach out to employers and say, can you sort of provide sort of an overview of how people are doing? That became a part of their recommendations that they could then leverage and get even more families and provide care. So a lot of innovative things have been happening in this area.
Thanks for the question, James. And Sarah, it sounds like you've been through your own personal experience. Do you want to summarize that and pose your question for Peggy?
Sure. Sorry for the long-winded question. I appreciated your distinction between, informal and formal care workers. And I just wonder your thoughts on protections for those in-between people. So me and my husband, we both work full-time, and we are lucky to have, flexible supervisors, flexible organizations. And I have a friend who's in the same boat with a child with a disability. Again, her and her spouse, flexible organizations. So, like the child has so many like doctor's appointments and also medical needs that really kind of make like morning routines or like lunchtime routines longer than maybe a typical child. And it's not so much that I would need to take FMLA, like that kind of seems like an all or nothing. And I don't understand FMLA a lot, so that might be inaccurate. But, that kind of seems more like you have a major event, you take FMLA for a large part of time for a given. But this is more like it's ongoing and it's a little bit less, and lucky for us, our supervisors are so flexible. But I feel, like I think about like frontline customer service people, like where's that flexibility? Can they work, still get their benefits, but maybe work a little bit less? And I just wonder your thoughts on, is there a need for or is there a movement towards like legislation or something that would kind of help meet people in the middle rather than like the choice of, having to put their family member in like private care or whatnot, or quitting their job to do it full time?
Yeah. So under the Family and Medical Leave Act, there is a type of care known as intermittent care that you might want to check into and see if that offers you any useful sort of strategies to think about. Obviously, if we're just, your question is about, let's think about these incredible care needs on the part of workers, right? Home care workers, by the way, unless they're working for an agency, they're not covered by the FMLA, right? Because the FMLA has a threshold. It only applies to employers that employ at least 50 workers. So any number of home care workers are not going to be covered by the FMLA. And so if we're focusing on, what do workers need, putting aside home care workers, what do workers need in order to confront some of these challenges? Well, another major limitation of the FMLA is it's not paid, right? You have to be in a position to actually take time off and sacrifice your payment in order to even utilize the FMLA. There are only 2 states, to my knowledge, that provide paid leave under their state FMLAs, and that is California and Massachusetts. So you're absolutely right in terms of, what we don't have and the things that we need. That certainly is a critical part of the missing infrastructure